The skies of the Second World War were not arenas of gallant duels. They were vast, mechanical abattoirs, factories of death suspended above the earth. From the English Channel to the steppes of Russia, the sky became an industry of killing, its product measured not in victories, but in sorties flown, gallons burned, and lives erased before they even fell. Most pilots never saw the man who killed them. Combat at 20,000 feet was not a dance of skill, but a flash of fate, a glint on the horizon, a shadow that arrived and vanished in seconds. By the time the victim understood, the cockpit had already filled with smoke. There was no warning, no heroism, only procedure, repetition, and the thin metal trust of an overworked engine. The public remembers the legends, the elliptical wings of the Spitfire, the howl of the Mustang, the menace of the Messerschmitt. Names turned into icons, stripped of oil and fear. But these machines, revered today in museums and air shows, were once no more than tools of endurance. The men inside them did not speak of glory. They spoke of fuel mixtures, oxygen lines, and frostbite. For the pilot, survival was not romantic. It was statistical. The average lifespan of a new airman in Bomber Command was 6 weeks. On the Eastern Front, Soviet pilots climbed into cockpits with barely 20 hours of training. When their names disappeared from rosters, no songs were written, no headlines printed. The myth of the noble sky knight came later, when nations needed poetry to explain the ruin. Memory turned machinery into myth, and exhaustion into honor. But beneath those polished stories lies a quieter truth, of men who faced the void not for medals, but because duty left them no choice. The truth about fighter planes isn't what we were told, and that truth begins not in triumph, but in silence. In the next chapter, that silence will break, as the first great aerial slaughter rewrites everything the world thought it knew about air combat. Posters showed grinning pilots in sunlight, young men with confidence painted onto their faces, the wind frozen in their hair. Governments printed them by the thousands, cheerful smiles beneath slogans of courage, adventure, and destiny. They were not meant to tell the truth. They were meant to make the truth bearable. Behind each image was a quieter reality, that most missions ended not in triumph, but in disappearance. The air war was statistical, not romantic. Of the thousands who took off each morning, many never returned, and most never fired a shot. Engagements were over in seconds, invisible even to the men fighting them. A flash of sunlight, a burst of tracer. Then the world vanished in flame or cloud. 70% of all aerial kills came not from duels, but from surprise, from the unseen advantage of altitude, speed, or luck. Skill mattered, but chance ruled. At altitude, the oxygen mask erased identity. The canopy sealed the pilot inside a machine that did not care who he was. Beneath layers of leather, glass, and noise, fear became a private companion. No audience, no applause, only procedure and silence. In the moments before battle, many pilots described a stillness, as if life itself paused to watch what men had made of the sky. Yet on the ground, propaganda told another story. Romantic posters and wartime newsreels spoke of chivalry and honor, of dogfights that resembled medieval duels. It was a necessary lie, a myth that comforted families and inspired recruits. But it turned technical survival into mythical heroism, rewriting fatigue and terror into legend. The truth was simpler and more profound. The sky was not a stage for knights. It was an industry of attrition, a cold theater of repetition and endurance. Every myth of the sky warrior diminishes the courage of those who fought without witnesses, whose bravery was quiet, unseen, and uncelebrated. And far from the posters, in the frozen cabins of their bombers, Another kind of courage was beginning to take shape, one that would soon redefine the very meaning of sacrifice. Across nations, 5 great distortions would come to define how we remember the air war, stories shaped not by pilots, but by poster artists, journalists, and the hunger of nations for symbols that could survive the truth. These myths turned an industrial slaughter into a legend of heroes and machines. But behind each one lay a quieter, colder reality, one that measured courage not in victories, but in endurance. Myth 1. The Spitfire single-handedly saved Britain. The Battle of Britain was never the duel of one aircraft against the Luftwaffe. The Spitfire became the emblem of defiance, but it was the slower, sturdier Hurricane that bore the weight of battle, destroying nearly 2/3 of enemy aircraft. The legend of the Spitfire endured because beauty is easier to worship than reliability. Myth 2. The Mustang won the war in Europe. The P-51 Mustang became the poster child of Allied air power, its sleek frame and long range celebrated as the weapon that broke Germany. But by the time the Mustang arrived in numbers, the Luftwaffe was already bleeding to death, outnumbered, outfueled, and outtrained. The Mustang did not win the war. It witnessed its collapse. The 3. German and Japanese aces were superhuman. Men like Erich Hartmann or Saburo Sakai were mythologized as sky gods, predators born for battle. In truth, their victories came from endurance, hundreds of missions, fought until exhaustion blurred time itself. The true miracle was not their skill, but their survival in a system that consumed its best men until none remained. Myth 4. Dogfighting was about skill, not luck. In the thin air above Europe, skill gave a man seconds. Luck gave him life. A glint in the sun, a jammed gun, a fraction of cloud, these decided who would see another dawn. The sky rewarded those who saw first, not those who fought best. Myth 5. The best pilots flew the best planes. In reality, the best survived because they adapted. Many flew outdated aircraft, patched together by exhausted crews. Victory belonged not to perfection, but to resilience. Each myth served a purpose, to make horror palatable, to turn attrition into legend. But the deeper truth lay in what those myths erased: fatigue, fear, and the quiet bravery of the forgotten majority. And far from the posters and the speeches, another truth was taking shape. In the laboratories and wind tunnels, where engineers prepared to rewrite the laws of flight itself. The summer of 1940 is remembered through the lens of sunlight and silhouette. A Spitfire banking above the English countryside, its wings glinting like a promise. The Battle of Britain has become inseparable from that image. A sleek machine, the embodiment of defiance. Yet history, stripped of myth, tells a different story. The aircraft that truly carried the burden of Britain's survival was not the Spitfire at all. It was the Hawker Hurricane, slower, older, and in every measurable way, less glamorous. When the Luftwaffe began its assault, Britain's fighter command fielded 32 squadrons of Hurricanes and only 19 of Spitfires. The Hurricane's fabric-covered wings and boxy frame seemed primitive beside the Spitfire's elegant curves of aluminum. But in the chaos of combat, reliability was worth more than beauty. It could be repaired in hours with wood and linen. Its engine was easier to service, its guns more stable in the turn. And when the numbers were tallied, the truth was undeniable. 60% of German aircraft were destroyed not by Spitfires, but by Hurricanes. To the men who flew them, the difference was never about prestige. It was about survival. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, who lost both legs before the war, famously said, "The Spitfire got the glory, but the Hurricane got the job done." The Hurricane pilots knew they were flying the planer sibling, the one the public rarely celebrated. Yet in their humility lay a form of courage rarely acknowledged, the kind that endures without applause. The myth of the Spitfire was born not from statistics, but from aesthetics, its sleek shape photographed beautifully, its name rolled easily across headlines, and its sound, the rising roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, stirred something primal in the British imagination. It looked like victory at a time when the nation needed to believe in one. The Spitfire was not merely an aircraft, it was a symbol of modernity, youth, and national grace under siege. But symbols have a cost. The legend of the Spitfire overshadowed the machine that truly bore the fight, and the crews who kept it alive under blackout skies. The Hurricane, patched and battered, became the unsung workhorse of Britain's defense. Heroism, in the end, is not perfection polished into myth. It is persistence performed without witnesses. And while Britain celebrated its elegant savior in the skies, its engineers were already looking beyond both planes, toward a design that would challenge gravity itself. The P-51 Mustang is remembered as the aircraft that conquered Europe's skies, the sleek savior that finally allowed Allied bombers to strike deep into Germany and return home. Its image has become inseparable from the idea of victory, sunlight glinting off silver wings, a machine of grace and power sweeping across a broken continent. Yet the truth, as always, is less cinematic and more human. The Mustang did not win the air war. It arrived when victory was already written in exhaustion, fuel shortages, and the slow death of the Luftwaffe itself. When the first Mustangs entered combat over Europe in late 1943, Germany's air defenses were already bleeding. Years of attrition had taken their toll. The Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, the constant night raids, each had drained the Luftwaffe of its most irreplaceable resource, trained pilots. By 1944, even experienced veterans were flying with untested cadets, men with barely 50 hours of flight time. The skies of Germany were still dangerous, but the edge of German air superiority had long since dulled. The true weapon that broke the Luftwaffe was not an aircraft at all. It was fuel, or rather, the lack of it. Allied bombers, guided by new radar and aided by resistance intelligence, systematically targeted refineries and synthetic fuel plants. Between May and September 1944, German aviation fuel production fell by nearly 90%. Fighters sat grounded for want of petrol. Others took off with barely enough to climb, fight, and return. The air war had become a siege of resources, not skill. The Mustang's arrival coincided with this turning point. Its long range allowed bombers to reach Berlin and back without facing the sky alone. It symbolized reach, control, inevitability. The Mustang made the final act possible, but it did not write the script. It was the instrument of a victory already shaped by strategy, not spectacle. Yet the pilots who flew it bore no illusions of glory. Their missions stretched for hours across frozen altitudes, where the cockpit canopy iced over, and the roar of the engine became a kind of loneliness. They flew not to conquer, but to protect, guarding formations of bombers that marched endlessly toward targets few would ever see. Their courage was quiet, cumulative, and cold. To call the Mustang the savior of Europe diminishes those who fought when the outcome was still uncertain, those who faced the full strength of an enemy not yet defeated. The P-51 was not the beginning of victory, but its echo. And far to the east, in skies untouched by the Mustang's shadow, another kind of aerial war was unfolding, one that would test endurance beyond technology and faith beyond reason. The names echo through the history books like legends. Erich Hartmann, the Blonde Knight of Germany, credited with 352 victories. Saburo Sakai, the Japanese ace who returned from missions half-blind, his plane riddled with bullets, his will unbroken. These men became symbols of mastery, of supernatural instinct and courage. Their numbers inspire awe. Yet when stripped of reverence, the truth behind those numbers speaks not of glory, but of exhaustion, of men trapped in a system that devoured its own champions. Hartmann's 352 kills spanned nearly 3 years of relentless combat. He flew over 1,400 missions, sometimes 4 or 5 in a single day. There were no rotations, no respite. German pilots remained at the front until they were shot down, captured, or killed. Their skill grew not from privilege, but from survival. Each mission refined instinct, yet eroded body and mind. Behind every victory lay the same cycle of fatigue and loss. By 1944, Hartmann's unit faced Soviet formations that were vast, inexperienced, and poorly trained. A cruel arithmetic that inflated his tally, but hid the truth. Germany was burning through pilots faster than it could replace them. In the Pacific, Saburo Sakai fought a different kind of war, but endured the same pattern of attrition. Japan's Zero pilots began the war as an elite brotherhood, the best-trained aviators in the world. But as casualties rose and training programs collapsed, their replacements entered combat with only weeks of flight time. The veterans, unable to rest, flew until their luck ran out. Sakai himself was hit in 1942 by a gunner over Guadalcanal, nearly blinded. Yet he managed to land his plane after a 1,000-kilometer flight home. He recovered, fought again, and lived long enough to see the empire he served destroyed by its own design. Their skill was undeniable. But skill, in these circumstances, became a curse. The better a man survived, the more he was asked to fight. There was no rotation to safety, no teaching post, no return home to parade. The Axis aces fought until the sky itself became a prison. By 1945, both Japan and Germany had lost nearly all their veterans. Their replacements, young, undertrained, terrified, were sent into the air to die in machines they barely knew how to control. The myth of the super ace endures because numbers are easier to celebrate than attrition. But these records were not achievements of invincibility. They were markers of desperation. Each victory represented another step toward collapse, each tally etched into the ledger of a war that consumed its best men first. And while the Axis chased legends in the clouds, the Allies turned to something colder and far more decisive: the science of mass production and the coming age of the machine. Cinema remembers the dogfight as an art, the sky as a stage where men performed courage in elegant spirals, tracing contrails like calligraphy across a perfect blue canvas. It is one of the most enduring illusions of the air war, the duel, the contest of equals. In truth, combat in the air was nothing of the sort. It was sudden, mechanical, and brutally one-sided. The man who fired first almost always won. The one who saw second almost never returned. At 20,000 feet, there was no warning. A flicker of light. A shadow above the sun. Then the tearing sound of cannon fire. For most airmen, the first sign of attack was the shudder of their own aircraft as metal tore through it. Pilots rarely saw the man who killed them, often not even the direction from which death arrived. There was no fight, one RAF veteran recalled, only the explosion and then silence. The idea of the turning duel, two pilots locked in graceful combat, was born from peacetime imagination, not wartime experience. Real engagements lasted seconds, not minutes. Fighter doctrine taught that position, altitude, and surprise outweighed bravery. The best pilots were not those who sought the duel, but those who avoided it entirely. The first to spot the enemy held the power of life and death. Everything else was noise. Technology only deepened this reality. As speeds climbed beyond 400 miles per hour, human reaction time ceased to matter. At closing speeds of over 700 miles per hour, a dogfight could be decided before either man fully understood what was happening. The air war became a matter of vectors, visibility, and energy. Mathematics played out in 3 dimensions. Victory was measured not in valor, but in seconds gained and degrees of turn. For the men inside those machines, the emotion of combat was not triumph, but relief. Relief that the other aircraft had burned instead of theirs. Relief that they would see the ground again. Many spoke later of guilt, the strange numbing awareness that the enemy had never even known they were there. In private diaries, the word kill appears less often than luck. Pilots did not feel like duelists. They felt like survivors of a mechanical lottery. And yet, when the war ended, nations reached for meaning. Artists and filmmakers turned physics into poetry, statistics into stories of courage. The myth of chivalry in the clouds gave families something to hold on to, a gentler memory than the truth of bodies falling unseen into the sea. It transformed attrition into artistry, a necessary illusion for a generation that had watched its youth vanish into the air. But in reality, there was no nobility in those encounters, only efficiency. The sky rewarded calculation, not courage. Fairness was an invention of the ground, where people could afford to pretend that war had rules. The myth of the noble dogfight was not born from remembrance. It was born from comfort. For those who returned, there was nothing noble about it at all. Only the sound of the engine, the flash of sunlight on metal, and the question every survivor asked when the silence returned. Why him, not me? And as this illusion of aerial chivalry faded, another truth emerged, that the future of air combat would no longer depend on eyesight or instinct, but on innovation itself. In wind tunnels and laboratories, a new kind of warfare was already taking shape, one that would strip the sky of all its romance. The enemy in the sky was not always human. For many pilots, it wore no uniform, carried no insignia, and fired no gun. It came instead as cold, hunger, and exhaustion, the silent companions of flight at the edge of endurance. At 20,000 feet, the air itself became hostile. Temperatures fell below -40. Frost crawled along the canopy. Oxygen masks froze from the moisture of breath. What began as engineering became a battle against the limits of the human body. Oxygen deprivation was the unseen assassin of the air war. Thin air dulled reflexes, clouded judgment, and invited hallucination. Many pilots never realized they were losing consciousness until their aircraft began to spiral. At that altitude, even thought was mechanical. Each movement, each breath, a struggle between precision and panic. The roar of the engine became a constant vibration, shaking bones, numbing hands, and eroding concentration hour by hour. By the end of a sortie, most men returned not triumphant, but trembling. Fatigue was the universal enemy. Combat rotations blurred days into one another. Pilots flew at dawn, repaired at dusk, and buried their comrades in between. Meals were eaten standing beside oil drums. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of sirens or engines starting for another mission. The line between courage and collapse grew thin. A few lost it entirely, sitting in the cockpit unable to take off, their hands refusing to obey orders their minds still understood. The military called it lack of moral fiber. The pilots called it what it was: fear paid in full. Machines, too, were traitors. Engines failed without warning, guns jammed, fuel gauges lied. More aircraft were lost to mechanical failure than to enemy fire in several campaigns. A single spark in an oxygen line, a hairline crack in a propeller, could decide a man's life. The cockpit was not a sanctuary. It was a cage of moving parts that could kill as easily as protect. The relationship between pilot and aircraft was one of uneasy faith. Trust the machine, but never believe in it. Training only deepened the tragedy. As losses mounted, replacements grew younger. Boys barely out of school found themselves strapped into machines they scarcely understood. Instructors were rushed, syllabuses cut. A few trainees completed fewer than 20 hours of flight before combat. Many never learned to land properly. Others never learned to fear properly, which was worse. For the veterans who watched them arrive, it felt like witnessing history repeating itself. Each new face another sacrifice to the same relentless machine. Heroism in such a world was not found in victory, but in endurance. It was the quiet decision to fly again after seeing a friend vanish into cloud and flame. It was lighting a cigarette with shaking hands and stepping once more into the same cockpit. Each mission carried not only the weight of survival, but of memory, the invisible burden of those who did not return. The Air War's final truth was not written in statistics, but in the exhaustion etched into every surviving face. The war of nerves outlasted the war of guns. Long after the last sortie, men would wake to the sound of engines that no longer existed, their minds still circling over enemy territory. To survive was the rarest victory of all, and even survival came at a cost, because soon the machines that had tested their endurance would begin to outgrow their masters entirely, and the next generation of pilots would face a weapon no courage could overcome. Every nation told itself the same comforting story, that its finest men flew its finest machines. It was a promise of fairness, a symmetry between courage and technology. But war does not distribute its gifts with justice. The best pilots rarely flew the best planes. They flew what was available, what was broken, what could be patched together overnight. Their mastery came not from perfection, but from improvisation. In the Soviet Union, aces took to the air in fighters that seemed almost improvised from the landscape itself. Yakovlev Yak-1s and Lavochkin La-5s, built partly from plywood, canvas, and glue. They were crude, cramped, and fragile, but in the hands of a determined pilot, they were alive. Soviet flyers learned to fight low, to turn tightly, to use the terrain as armor. They fought not for elegance, but for survival. Their courage was measured not by altitude or speed, but by endurance, how many times they could climb again into a cockpit that rattled like a coffin. On the other side of the world, young Americans entered combat in machines that were worn before they even took off. Many learned their craft in training aircraft that had already served 2 generations of cadets. Patched wings, tired engines, controls loose from overuse. When they arrived in Europe or the Pacific, they often faced the enemy in planes inferior to those they fought. Early P-40s and P-39s struggled against the more agile German and Japanese designs. Victory depended not on technology, but on understanding its limits, turning weakness into strategy, malfunction into muscle memory. Even the legendary machines of the war were never flawless. The Spitfire, symbol of grace, was temperamental at high altitude and prone to engine seizure in tight climbs. The P-51 Mustang, praised for its range and power, suffered from frozen fuel lines and unreliable coolant systems in the winter of 1944. The German Me-109, icon of the Luftwaffe, had a narrow landing gear that claimed almost as many aircraft in takeoffs and landings as in combat. The Japanese Zero, feared for its maneuverability, had no armor to protect the pilot. Every nation fielded dreams disguised as weapons, each as flawed as the men who flew them. The aces who survived did so not because of their aircraft, but because they adapted faster than those trying to master perfection. They learned to sense the pulse of the machine through vibration, to feel the edge of a stall through instinct rather than instrument. They knew when to push and when to yield. In a sky ruled by chaos, survival became a conversation between man and metal, an uneasy truce between design and desperation. The myth of the best pilot in the best plane persists because it makes war seem logical, as if excellence guarantees survival. But the truth is humbler and harder. Victory belonged to those who learned to live with imperfection. It was the pilot who coaxed an extra climb from a damaged engine, who landed a crippled fighter on a frozen field, who found balance in an aircraft that wanted to kill him. These were the real masters of the air. War did not reward beauty or precision. It rewarded adaptability, patience, and luck. In that sense, the sky was never fair, and never meant to be. Because while men struggled to perfect the machines they flew, another force was already rising, a kind of perfection no human could endure. In hidden laboratories across Germany and Britain, engineers were designing weapons that would strip the pilot from the equation entirely, and soon the age of the jet would begin. Behind every photograph of a smiling ace, every headline proclaiming 100 victories, lay the silence of 10 others who never came back. The skies of the Second World War were not filled with heroes, but with statistics. For every name remembered, dozens vanished into smoke, sea, or snow, their stories unwritten because no one survived to tell them. The truth of air warfare was not glory, it was attrition. Between 1939 and 1945, the Allied air forces trained roughly 125,000 fighter pilots. 40,000 of them never returned. Some were lost in combat, many to accidents, weather, or mechanical failure. In those years, flight itself was still an experiment, one conducted at the edge of human ability. A single miscalculated turn, a burst oil line, or a missed navigation fix could erase a life as quickly as any bullet. The air war consumed men not by intent, but by indifference. For Germany, the price was even higher. The Luftwaffe began the war with perhaps the most skilled and disciplined air arm in the world. Its early victories over Poland, France, and the Low Countries were so complete that the system began to believe in its own invincibility. But by 1943, that arrogance had become fatal. The German pilot training program collapsed under pressure. Recruits were rushed into cockpits after barely 1/10 the flight hours their instructors had received. By 1944, most new Luftwaffe pilots died within 10 missions, some within 1. A few never made it home from their first. The airfields of Europe became graveyards of youth. Japan's sacrifice was starker still. The Imperial Navy's aviators began the war as the most skilled on Earth, products of years of ruthless selection and training. But that very perfection destroyed them. As casualties mounted in the Pacific, replacements were rushed through in months, not years. By late 1944, Japan was losing 20% of all naval aviators every month. Entire squadrons disappeared into the ocean, their losses recorded only as numbers. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, had become a flying coffin. The men inside knew it, and still they flew. For all nations, the measure of success was not victory, but survival. To live long enough to complete a tour, to see another dawn, became the true definition of achievement. Victory in the air was never clean. It was measured in exhaustion, in the number of missions endured, the friends buried, the hours spent listening for the voice of a wingman who would never answer again. The myth of the few, the ace, the invincible, obscures the sacrifice of the many. The war was not won by heroes, but by endurance. The courage that mattered most was quiet. It belonged to the pilot who climbed back into a repaired aircraft after watching his squadron vanish the day before. To the ground crew who patched bullet holes without knowing if the same pilot would return to need them again. to the replacements who learned on the job and often died teaching the next. These men did not seek recognition. They sought only to complete the next mission because stopping was not an option. History remembers the great names, Galland, Johnson, Koszedub, Bong, but for every ace who lived, hundreds fell without record. Their sacrifice was the foundation upon which victory was built, invisible but essential. Without them, the myths could not exist. And when the war finally ended, those who survived faced a different kind of silence. They had won nothing permanent, only the right to remember those who did not return. In the end, real courage was anonymity. It was the will to fly again when everyone else was gone, to rise once more into a sky that had already taken too much. But as the smoke cleared and the world rebuilt, another kind of sky was forming, colder, faster, and less human. The next generation of pilots would no longer fight for endurance. They would fight for relevance. By 1944, the air war no longer resembled the stories that had once inspired it. What began as a contest of innovation had become a vast engine of exhaustion, a machine that devoured men, fuel, and faith faster than any nation could replace them. The sky that once promised freedom had become a furnace. For the first time, both sides began to understand what total war truly meant. Not victory through courage, but survival through attrition. Across Europe, airfields were bombed faster than they could be rebuilt. Smoke rose from runways that had been repaired the day before. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had once controlled the continent's airspace, was now fighting from the ruins of its own infrastructure. Engines were cannibalized for spare parts. Ground crews filled bomb craters with their bare hands. And above them, Allied formations stretched horizon to horizon, waves of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and B-17s that no German defense could stop. Desperation forced the Luftwaffe into cruelty. By late 1944, it was sending barely trained boys into combat, students who had fired their guns only at the ground, who had never flown above the clouds. Their commanders watched them take off, knowing most would not return. Against them came American and British pilots flying modern aircraft in overwhelming numbers, backed by radar control and fuel supplies the Reich could no longer imagine. German skies, once a theater of mastery, had become a graveyard of youth. Far to the east, Japan faced the same slow catastrophe. The once dominant Imperial Navy was now reduced to fragments. The Zero, the pride of 1941, was outclassed, its pilots outnumbered, its design obsolete. But what Japan lacked in aircraft and fuel, it replaced with conviction, or perhaps despair. The kamikaze was born not from fanaticism, but from absence. No trained pilots remained, no veterans to teach the next generation. In their place came volunteers, boys barely 20 years old, given a plane, a letter, and a single instruction. In the skies over Okinawa and Leyte Gulf, they turned themselves into weapons. The radio messages they left behind were not angry, but quiet. Apologies to parents, gratitude to comrades, reflections on honor and duty. They believed their sacrifice could slow the inevitable. It did not. The Allied fleets kept advancing, the bombers kept coming, and the skies filled not with duels, but with falling bodies. Everywhere the romance of flight evaporated. What began as invention and ambition ended as fatigue and repetition. Pilots no longer saw the sky as an escape. It had become an unmarked grave, a place where machines fell burning into the same ocean that swallowed their pilots whole. For those still fighting, the act of taking off each morning was no longer about glory. It was simply an act of will, a refusal to surrender to mathematics. The war in the air had reached its breaking point, not because of a decisive battle, but because of exhaustion. Factories could not build fast enough. Teachers could not train fast enough. Fuel could not flow fast enough. By the final winter, every flight carried the weight of inevitability. The myth of the Sky Knight, noble, free, unbound, had dissolved in the cold logic of industrial war. At 20,000 feet, where clouds once symbolized possibility, there was only smoke and silence. The last illusions of glory burned away, leaving nothing but endurance. And the question that haunted every survivor, what had it all been for? Yet even in that silence, something new was being born. For in laboratories and testing fields across Germany, Britain, and America, engineers were already working on machines that would redefine the future. Faster, colder, beyond the reach of human limitation. The age of flight was ending. The age of speed was about to begin. The cockpit was a world no larger than a coffin, a sealed chamber of glass and steel, balanced between life and oblivion. Inside, a single man sat surrounded by gauges, switches, and levers that demanded absolute obedience. Every sound mattered. Every vibration had meaning. Each flight was a conversation with the machine, a negotiation between trust and terror, precision and fate. To fly was to surrender control, even while appearing to command it. The stick responded not just to strength, but to subtlety. Too much force, and a wing could shear away. Too little, and lift was lost forever. At high altitude, frost crept across the canopy. The air thinned until breathing became an act of discipline. The oxygen mask, the humming engine, the ceaseless vibration. Together they created a rhythm that blurred thought into instinct. Some pilots sang softly to steady their nerves. Others whispered to the aircraft as if it were alive, pleading with it to hold together a few minutes longer. The loneliness was absolute. A man could fly, surrounded by hundreds of others, and still feel utterly alone. Radio chatter was brief, functional, devoid of comfort. Beneath the headset, the world reduced itself to noise, motion, and fear. Before takeoff, silence was its own test. Engines coughed in the cold, refusing to start. Some pilots wept quietly when they didn't, not from frustration, but relief. A failed engine could mean another day alive. Yet when it finally roared to life, duty erased hesitation. They climbed back in, because others already had. From the ground, it seemed heroic. Men soaring through sunlight, chasing glory across the clouds. But inside the cockpit, bravery looked different. It was mechanical, repetitive. Each flight was a ritual of preparation. Check the fuel, test the flaps, scan the gauges, breathe. Fear was managed through habit. The hands moved even when the mind faltered. For many, courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to follow procedure while terrified. They fought unseen, no audience, no witness, only the machine. Yet in that solitude, they carried nations on their shoulders. The fate of armies, cities, and civilians depended on whether a single pilot could keep his aircraft steady long enough to release its payload or hold formation under fire. Responsibility in the sky was immense, yet invisible. There was no room for hesitation, no space for reflection until after landing, if landing ever came. When it did, the moments after flight were almost sacred. Pilots walked away from their machines slowly, as if parting from something living. They carried the smell of oil and cordite, the ringing in their ears, and the quiet knowledge that each sortie could have been their last. Conversations were brief. Jokes replaced grief. They smoked, wrote letters, and waited for the next call to climb again. Their bravery was not cinematic. It was maintenance, of nerves, of machines, of duty. No grand speeches, no orchestral triumphs, just repetition and resolve. They were craftsmen of survival, engineers of endurance. Every flight was an act of faith, in their crew, in their aircraft, and in a cause too vast to see from 20,000 feet. For them, survival was the only honor. For us, forgetting that is the only disrespect. Their war was not fought for fame, but against failure, against the silence of a dead engine, the pressure of an empty sky, the unrelenting weight of knowing that the next sortie might be the last. The human face of the machine was never the smiling ace in the newspaper photograph. It was the exhausted pilot, hands trembling from cold and fatigue, stepping down from his cockpit with the expressionless calm of someone who had seen too much and knew he would go back anyway. And while those men held the line with their courage, far behind them, others were working to erase them from the sky entirely, designing a new kind of aircraft, one that would need no pilot at all. When peace finally came, the world was too weary for complexity. It did not want exhaustion, grief, or moral uncertainty. It wanted heroes. The chaos of the air war, the endless fatigue, the attrition, the anonymous courage was too vast, too human to process. So nations began to distill it into something simpler. They took the noise and made it music. They turned survivors into symbols. Governments, eager to rebuild faith, needed figures who could stand for victory. The public needed stories that could be understood in 2 hours or printed on a poster. The pilots, who had lived through years of repetition and loss, became characters in a national narrative, clean, confident, and noble. The messy truth of endurance was replaced by the clarity of triumph. Films and books spoke of duels and destiny, not frostbite and fear. The air war became theater, and its participants became myth. In Britain, the Battle of Britain was reborn as a legend of the few. Churchill's words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," became scripture. The hurricane squadrons that had borne the brunt of the fighting faded from public memory. In their place stood the Spitfire, elegant, photogenic, eternal. The image of the young, smiling RAF pilot in his leather jacket became the face of national pride, a portrait of youth preserved by selective memory. In the United States, the same transformation unfolded. The Mustang, the Flying Fortress, the Pacific Carrier pilot, each became a symbol of ingenuity and courage, cleansed of the attrition that had defined them. War movies filled the void between memory and myth. Aerial combat, once decided in seconds of terror, was now replayed in long, graceful arcs. The dead could not object. Germany and Japan, too, remade their pasts in the only way they could, through mourning and distance. The aces of the Luftwaffe and Imperial Navy were recast as tragic geniuses, victims of politics and circumstance. Men like Hartmann and Sakai were revered not as symbols of conquest, but of endurance. Their skill became a way to remember without glorifying. Even defeat was given poetry. But the cost of these narratives was subtle and enduring. In the process of creating legends, the world erased the ordinary. The mechanics who worked until dawn, the instructors who trained boys who would not return, the radio operators and gunners who fought without names, all disappeared from the story. Complexity was sacrificed for clarity, humanity for heroism. What emerged was comforting, but false. It allowed nations to believe that war had been about courage, not calculation, about individuals, not industries. It made history feel noble again, as if the horror had been redeemed by beauty. The myth was not malicious, it was a form of healing, but it was also a theft. It stole from those who had lived the truth, leaving them to watch their memories repainted in colors they did not recognize. For many veterans, peace felt less like relief and more like exile. They returned to a world that no longer spoke their language, a world eager to celebrate the legend, but reluctant to hear the reality. When they tried to describe the noise, the exhaustion, the emptiness, people changed the subject. They were expected to smile for photographs, not to remember the smell of burning fuel. In the decades that followed, the myth hardened into memory. The air war became an epic of courage, rather than a study in endurance. The truth, that victory had been statistical, industrial, and humanly unbearable, faded behind the iconography of aces and aircraft. But memory, like warfare, is never neutral. It, too, is a battlefield, one where comfort and honesty are forever at odds. And even as the stories of heroes solidified, a new kind of legend was already being built, one not of men, but of machines. In the laboratories of a world now at peace, the jet age was beginning, and with it, a silence deeper than any the propeller had ever known. Today they rest in silence, polished, preserved, suspended beneath museum lights. The Spitfire, the Mustang, the Messerschmitt, their metal gleams as if time itself had forgiven them. Visitors lean close, tracing the smooth lines of aluminum, whispering words like beauty, grace, legend. Children press their faces to the glass, imagining adventure. But the airframes they admire were once instruments of exhaustion, fragments of a world that bled to make them possible. Each plane is a coffin of genius, designed by hands that understood both creation and destruction. The engineers who shaped their wings measured not just lift and drag, but survival and death. Every rivet was placed by someone who knew what failure meant, yet today they appear weightless, eternal, artifacts of victory rather than vessels of suffering. The noise that once surrounded them has been scrubbed away. In their stillness, we mistake silence for peace. To the casual eye, a Spitfire's wing is a masterpiece of proportion. To those who remember, it is also an archive of fear. Beneath that graceful curve, once pulsed the final heartbeat of a friend, the man in the next aircraft who never made it home. The Mustang's cockpit, now polished for display, once reeked of fuel, sweat, and desperation. The guns that lined the wings were not symbols of freedom. They were tools of arithmetic, a fraction of a second's advantage, measured in lives. Museums call them icons of courage, and perhaps they are. But courage, in those days, was not beautiful. It was mechanical, repetitive, often joyless. The men who flew these machines did not see romance in their reflections. They saw fatigue. They saw duty. Many could not look at these aircraft again after the war. Some wept at the sound of a Merlin engine starting. Others could not hear it at all without returning to the moment where the world had gone quiet behind them. When we visit these relics now, we see the perfection of the design, not the cost of its creation. We see symmetry, not suffering. The passage of time has turned weapons into art, noise into nostalgia. It is easy to admire them, to feel pride in their shape, to imagine the sky as clean and noble. But that illusion dishonors the truth. These were machines that outlived their men, engines that endured where flesh could not. Their immortality is accidental. The aluminum was preserved because it could be polished. The men were forgotten because they could not be restored. The exhibits remember the airframes. The air remembers the voices. If one listens carefully inside these museums, beneath the hum of guided tours and camera shutters, there is another sound. The faint, imagined echo of engines starting, of oxygen masks snapping into place, of youth marching toward the clouds. The heroes who flew them would not recognize the myths we built. They did not ask to be legends. They wanted rest, truth, and silence. They did not dream of statues or documentaries. They dreamed of going home. When they spoke of their aircraft, it was with a mixture of affection and fear, as one might speak of a wild animal, respected, loved, but never trusted. We have made them eternal. They have become our mirrors, reminders of an age when courage and tragedy shared the same wings. But to understand them fully, one must strip away the polish and listen without nostalgia. Beneath the varnish of history lies the sound of breathing, the tremor of hands, the weight of humanity inside the machine. The planes endure, but the men are gone. Their voices fade, their stories collapse into the silence between displays. Yet the air still holds their echoes, waiting for those willing to hear, not glory, but truth. And beyond that silence, beyond the memory of men and propellers, waits the future they unknowingly built, a sky no longer flown by humans, but by something colder, faster, and beyond remembrance. The sky was never a place for glory. It was a place of endurance, of discipline, of loss. The men who climbed into those machines did not rise toward legend. They rose toward uncertainty, toward a duty that asked everything and promised nothing. They flew not because they believed in myth, but because they were told the world below depended on them. The clouds, for them, were not symbols of freedom. They were a battlefield without boundaries. History, in its hunger for heroes, has enlarged their image but diminished their struggle. Myths make heroes larger, but they make their humanity smaller. We remember the numbers, the kills, the aces, the victories, but not the hands that shook before each mission, or the quiet conversations before takeoff when fear hung heavier than the fuel. The sky did not separate them from the earth. It magnified their fragility. They did not fight for perfection. They fought for time, for one more flight, one more dawn, one more chance to see the ground again. Their courage was not cinematic. It was cautious, deliberate, and often silent. It existed in the decision to return to the cockpit after watching others vanish. It lived in the repetition of rituals, checking the flaps, testing the guns, whispering the same words before takeoff, because they had worked last time, and maybe they would work again. The pilots of the Second World War were not gods in machines. They were fragile souls mastering terror with procedure and habit. They existed on the narrow edge between life and invention, trusting engines built by men as mortal as themselves. Their bravery lay not in invincibility, but in awareness, the knowledge that each flight could be their last, and the acceptance that they would go anyway. What they left behind is not only history, but instruction. Their lives remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, that endurance is a form of faith, and that duty, however painful, is what holds civilization together when everything else breaks. Remembering them truthfully is the greatest honor we can give. To strip away the polish and face the silence is to understand what they truly achieved. The myths betrayed them by promising immortality, but their courage speaks louder still, in the simplicity of their acts, in the humility of their resolve. The legend of the air war may belong to the aircraft, but the truth belongs to the men who flew them, men who endured exhaustion, doubt, and terror with a calm that never sought admiration. The world they left behind still looks upward, still hears the distant hum of their engines in memory. But if we listen closely, beyond the nostalgia, we hear something quieter, not triumph, but endurance, not spectacle, but humanity. They flew into legend, but they deserve to be remembered as men.